Pandas! Everyone loves them. Their cute faces, hilarious antics, and fascinating preference for bamboo. At the Smithsonian's National Zoo in Washington, D.C., pandas are one of the most cherished parts of the city's identity. However, pandas aren't just adorable. They are living political tools of a growing superpower, China. This panda is no mere panda. Beneath its literal soft, cuddly power lies a connection to a system that exploits pandas and the nations hosting them in their own zoos, undermining conservation efforts and international trust. This is panda diplomacy. Panda diplomacy, while presented as a symbol of goodwill and conservation, is actually more of a tool for China to advance its political and economic agenda, often at the expense of panda conservation and international trust. But let's take a look at how this came about. The origins of panda diplomacy trace back to the Tang dynasty in the 7th century, when pandas were gifted to Japan. In modern history, the Mao era saw pandas used to build strategic alliances after it was left politically isolated after the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Such is the case for the gift of 2 pandas to the U.S. following President Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972 to normalize relations between the two countries, as seen here with Pat Nixon, Richard Nixon's wife. Pandas quickly became not just an international emblem of cuteness and conservation, but also a cultural icon in the West. China, realizing the value of gifting pandas, by 1983 had gifted 24 pandas to 9 different countries after they had recognized China's sovereignty, symbolizing goodwill and friendship. However, in 1984, this all changed when pandas were declared endangered. Under Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, China shifted from gifting pandas to leasing them, marking the second phase of panda diplomacy. Under the lease program, zoos hosting pandas would have to pay $1 million annually per panda and $400 for every cub born to China. Moreover, all cubs are Chinese property and must return to China by the age of 4, even if they're born in a different country. Under the lease program, China would generate both income for panda conservation and new pandas, which was critical for China to help save the symbolic species from extinction. Again, all of the funds gathered from zoos were supposed to be allocated to generate panda conservation in China, but as we'll see later, that was not always true. Anyhow, the program stipulated that pandas sent abroad should be encouraged to reproduce and to breed. The loan program works on 10-year leases, which gets renewed for 5 or 10-year increments. However, as we'll come to see, these panda loans came to be used as coercive tactics employed by the Chinese, which harms both panda conservation efforts and international relationships. China's panda diplomacy strategically aligns with its top trading partners to reinforce political and, most critically, economic relationships. As a matter of fact, researchers at the University of Oxford and the American Enterprise Institute found panda loans often coincide with major trade deals, meaning China emphasizes economic relationships over conservation. There is not only a correlation between China's trade volume to countries and the amount of pandas that country has, but also China's top 10 trade partners, which all but 2 countries, that being Vietnam and Brazil, had at least 2 pandas in the year 2020. Additionally, Australia, France, and Canada received pandas after agreeing to supply China with nuclear technology and uranium. Scotland secured a pair of pandas following the 2011 agreement to share offshore drilling technology and provide salmon and Range Rovers to China. These exchanges demonstrate how pandas reinforce China's trade relationships, turning conservation into a tool that undermines genuine international cooperation. Effectively, pandas have become pawns, get it, pawns, paws and pawns, whatever, to a country bent on emphasizing market transactions over the conservation of the species. Panda diplomacy is also used as a tool for coercion. For example, after warning President Obama not to meet with the Dalai Lama in 2010, China withdrew 2 US-born pandas when the meeting occurred, signaling its disapproval. Similarly, Norway, despite decades of salmon exports to China, was excluded from panda agreements after awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, a jailed Chinese dissident. Environmental concerns further complicate these agreements, as seen in Scotland, which agreed to increase salmon exports by 50% to meet Chinese demand despite ecological risks. During the Trump administration's tariff disputes, China failed to renew U.S. panda leases, leading to all pandas in U.S. zoos returning to China by November of 2023. Although the absence of pandas in American zoos reflected and corresponded with the strain in U.S.-China relations, on October 15, 2024, President Xi Jinping of China sent 2 pandas to Washington, D.C. in what he calls an envoy of friendship. These coercive tactics originate in the third phase of panda diplomacy, which followed the devastating 2008 Sichuan earthquakes, which harmed panda habitats and conservation facilities. According to researchers at the University of Oxford, in the emerging third phase of panda diplomacy, panda loans are associated with nations supplying China with valuable resources and technology and symbolize China's willingness to build Guangxi, namely deep trade relationships characterized by trust, reciprocity, loyalty, and longevity. Notable is the correlation of Guangxi loan deals with nations supplying resources and technologies to China in the aftermath of the 2008 earthquake in panda habitats. So, panda diplomacy's first phase began in the Mao era, with building strategic relationships, and then in the second phase, they created the loan system. And now in the third phase, pandas have shifted from symbols of conservation to, again, pawns in China's larger and much more broader strategy to expand its influence and build relationships globally. In the next section, I'll show how this harms and could possibly be detrimental to panda conservation in China and perhaps the entire panda species. Although China claims success in panda conservation, the reality is actually very complicated. Nearly all pandas in the world are owned by China because globally, pandas are only found in southwestern China. According to the World Wildlife Fund, the wild panda population has grown to 1,864 pandas. Of these, 600 live in captivity in Chinese zoos, sanctuaries, and breeding centers, while only 60 are housed in zoos outside China. Because of these numbers, in 2016, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, the global authority on endangered species, downgraded pandas from endangered to vulnerable. Progress, right? Well, as we'll see, much of this progress is actually overstated. The Chinese government, for example, was livid about this change because it made pandas less valuable both financially and politically. Remember, each panda costs zoos around the world $1 million annually, and all that soft power goes away if it doesn't become valuable. They argued the downgrade could threaten tourism within China. But the IUCN decision was based on the Chinese government's own data on the panda population, which showed a stable and growing population of pandas. However, according to anonymous Chinese scientists, the Chinese government's official number of pandas, an insanely precise number of 1,864 pandas, is a political number, and that the IUCN's downgrade plays into a rosy picture painted by the Chinese government that does not actually represent the deteriorating situation for pandas in the wild and in captivity. This fact highlights the core problem that the decision of the IUCN obscures, that there is a deep-set corruption within the Chinese conservation system that uses funds provided by zoos worldwide to fuel mass panda breeding, which only succeeded in breeding more pandas for zoos and not for the wild. This ultimately prevents the success of the entire panda loan program by harming genetic diversity among pandas and not growing the population of wild pandas. Let me explain. Chinese conservation efforts focus on primarily captive breeding rather than habitat restoration, meaning that their main concern is not genetic diversity, but simply the quantity of pandas. For instance, a quarter of all pandas in captivity descend from one single male, named Pon Pon, or as I like to say, Genghis Pon. This genetic bottleneck raises serious concerns about the long-term survival of the species if there is such limited genetic diversity. Moreover, China's breeding facilities have become virtual panda mills, where artificial insemination is widely used. But those pandas born in breeding facilities have only increased the number of pandas born in captivity, not in the wild. This means that when trying to get pandas who were born in captivity to breed and survive in the wild, it has failed because they have limited survival skills. And what I mean by limited survival skills is that the panda mills force female pandas to give birth, and then they take the baby pandas away to be raised by humans, so they aren't even raised by other pandas. Even if pandas are successfully sent into the wild, their habitats in China are shrinking. According to a report made by Chinese and American scientists, wild pandas have less territory to roam in than they did in the 1980s, before of the influx of funds from foreign zoos. Why? Because China is building extensive infrastructure around panda nature reserves to develop tourism around the area. Much of it is funded by zoo fees intended for conservation. By building more and more, it slowly restricts panda habitats. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service commented that although they understood the need for an establishment of infrastructure in China and around the nature reserves, the Fish and Wildlife Service said that the construction of facilities alone would not accomplish the goal of enhancing the survival of pandas in the wild. But the zoo industry disagreed, challenging that conservation activities in the wild cannot occur if the infrastructure does not exist. But how much infrastructure is actually enough? How much will it cost? And as we'll come to see, why is there so much secrecy surrounding it? Under U.S. law in the Panda Loan Program, 70% of all conservation money sent to China from the U.S. zoos must and is required to go to panda conservation efforts in China. However, investigations led by the New York Times reveal widespread misuse of conservation funds. For example, millions of dollars of funds from U.S. zoos was diverted to unrelated building projects in China, including apartments, museums, local government offices, and even the purchase of computer and satellite TV, while millions more remain unaccounted for. Remember how China was building infrastructure around nature reserves, which was restricting panda habitats? Yeah, that was using funds from zoos. Despite this, U.S. zoo administrators turn a blind eye to these problems, because if they question or cut off the money fueling China's illegal spending with zoo funds intended for panda conservation, China could demand the return of pandas. And that would harm both the zoo and the wellness of the panda species. Remember, this investigation only followed the funds from zoos in the United States, so all the other zoos in the countries around the world have also contributed millions of dollars. And you can imagine that their funds might just as well be misused as the ones from the United States. As the chairman of the foundation which represented all American zoos with pandas, David Town, said in 2009, "You had to take their word. China felt it was not our business, that we got the pandas and we shouldn't tell them how to spend the money." This rather disturbing fact raises the question, is this iconic species being conserved or commodified? Through conservation, trade, and political acts, panda diplomacy demonstrates how soft power can obscure political and economic ambitions. Yes, pandas can represent China's goodwill and cultural significance, but their use as mere tools for some strategic goal undermines conservation goals. As we saw, the conservation of the panda species, the true purpose of panda diplomacy and the loan program, has taken a back burner and essentially has been compromised by China's own objectives over genuine relationships and progress. How can countries ensure funds intended for conservation are used for conservation? And how can we hold China accountable if they are not used for conservation? And by getting pandas, do nations perpetuate panda diplomacy? But most importantly, is it possible to disassociate these iconic creatures from a geopolitical power game? Only time will tell what this means for the panda species. Thank you.